I don't know how many of you remember, there was a commercial a few years ago that went something like this. I love you, couch. You give us comfort, and we give you bare feet, back sweat, and Gordo's everything. I love you, but sometimes you stink. You know, it was such a popular commercial that over time it spawned quite a few variations of it. You may remember, I think it was about 2017, 18. And what the company is selling in that ad is something that's supposed to clean the air in your home so that instead of all these unwanted smells, all you have left is the perfume of this product. And so in this commercial, if you do remember, you have all these maniac house owners with a bottle in each hand, and they're just spraying everything they can. It's just anything they see, they spray. And what they're doing is actually they're dispensing one smell to cover another smell. And so the ad says, spray our product, and you won't smell Gordo, and you won't smell Julius Caesar or the bathroom in the basement anymore, and life will be perfect again. Just use our product. Well, as we continue our series on grace this morning, we learned a number of weeks ago that we were given this grace freely. It came without cost. We couldn't earn it. We didn't deserve it. We didn't have a right to it. In fact, the only way we could get it was to receive it as it was given, which is as a gift. And so we did. And over time, we realized that not only did we have this gift given to us and forgiveness of sin, but then, as we saw last week, God piles on this plethora of signing bonuses that come along with it. But how many of us realize today that so often with privilege comes responsibility? And one of the things that God is looking for us, or from us, is He wants us to become like Him. He wants us to become dispensers of this grace that we have received. You see, we were never meant to keep it just to ourselves. And so if I can use this imagery this morning, in a sense, we're like this gigantic bottle of perfume. And everywhere we go, we are supposed to be spraying grace into situations. Our finger is to be constantly on the trigger, so that everywhere we go, people are going to smell this very distinct odor of grace. Jesus said on one occasion, what you have received freely, be prepared to freely give to others. So if you have received this grace, if I have received this grace, that we need to be willing to demonstrate that same grace to every person that we interact with in our days. However, what is often sad is that sometimes the smell that Christians leave behind them is anything but pleasant. Too often it's divisive, or it's judgmental, or it's argumentative. All these rotten odors that tarnish the name of Christ instead of lifting it up. I've heard people say on occasion, not very often, thankfully, sure it's never happened in this church, but I have heard people say, if he or she is a Christian, if that's what it means to be a follower of Jesus, count me out. I just don't know if I want to go in that direction. And that is the opposite of what we should be when Christ lives in us. And so to teach us to be grace dispensers, Paul is going to give 4 commands in the book of Romans, chapter 14, as to how we can pass this grace on to other people, this grace that we undeservedly received. We freely received it. Now we're going to freely give it to others. And I want to just spend some time on those 4 commands that Paul gives to us. But before we actually look at them, let me kind of set the context for you in what was happening as Paul is writing this letter, because letters were written in the Bible to address certain issues. And so Paul is writing to the church that is in the capital city of the empire, the city of Rome. It's very likely that this church started like most churches did back then. Most of the people, if not exclusively, that would have been made up of people of Jewish background and Jewish faith. But as time begins to go on, some Gentiles start following Jesus, and they're coming into the church, and that's beginning to create some issues. And then to make matters worse, in 49 AD, the emperor at the time, his name was Claudius, he decides he's going to expel every single Jew from the city. And the reason he's going to do that is because, and this is written down historically, because the Jews were getting in a fight about somebody called Chrestus. That's how it was written in the language of the day. Now, likely what he's referring to is that there was some dispute going on about this person named Jesus Christ. And some Jews are against it. Of course, some Jews are coming to faith. So all the Jews in the church in Rome now have to leave the city, and the only people that are left now are Gentiles. And so now it's the Gentiles who become the worship team, and it's the Gentiles become the board, and they're the teachers, and they're the people who fill all the empty holes. But 5 years later, Claudius is assassinated, and the Jews start to trickle back into the city. And of course, some of those coming back are Christians. And now these Christians return, and they find that their church is not what it used to be. It's adopted this flavor of Gentiles. And that's going to raise some issues. That's going to raise some problems, because each person, each group is going to need to work through some things. And hence we have these chapters in the book of Romans. So let's look at the first command on what grace dispensers are to look like. Here it is. Grace dispensers accept that there are going to be differences between us. Now, along with this major issue, if you got Jews on one side, you got Gentiles on the other, this church was experiencing two really key controversies. There might have been a third one, but two for sure. And it was beginning to divide them. The first one was, is it right or wrong to eat meat that has been offered to idols? And second, what is the actual right day to worship? Is it Saturday, like the Jews have been used to doing, or is it Sunday, which was the day of the resurrection of Christ? Now, what makes this so difficult to try and resolve is that there's no explicit teaching in Scripture about either of these two things. It's kind of a gray area, or as Paul calls it, the beginning of chapter 14, he calls it, well, these are disputable matters. There's no chapter, there's no verse that you can go to and look for advice. In fact, it probably has more to do with personal conscience rather than a list of rules from the Bible. Now, maybe today we hear these early church controversies and we might say to ourselves, really? Like, you guys are fighting about things like that? But for them, it was critical. It was important. And so Paul, knowing that this has the potential to tear the church apart, he says this in chapter 14, verse 1. He says, accept him whose faith is weak. Or as the Message version of the Bible puts it, welcome with open arms fellow believers who don't see things the way you do. Do you know there has always been, probably will always be, differences of opinion between Christians on a variety of subjects, particularly trying to define what is holy and what is not holy. If you go back to the 1500s, a man by the name of John Calvin, from him came that whole stream of Christianity called Calvinism. But in the 1500s, there was a whole bunch of things that he, as the leader of the church, at least part of the church, he said, we shouldn't do these things. These are not good things. And so things like feasting, dancing, singing was forbidden. You couldn't have pictures in your home on the wall. Church bells were out. Organs were out. Couldn't swear, couldn't play cards. You couldn't hunt. For all the men in the church who might like hunting, you couldn't do that, sorry. And you could not name your children after anyone but Old Testament figures. And so they put a father in jail for 4 days because he called his son Claude. They also put a lady in prison for a number of days because her hairdo reached what was deemed to be an immoral height. Now, I just kind of was looking this morning when you came in. I had my yardstick out. I was going to check and see. But thankfully, there's no beehives here today, so I think we're okay. But back then, if you had a beehive hairdo, you were not allowed in the church. You had to go home and redo it all and come back again with flat hair. Supposedly, you were holy if you adhered to these rules, and if you didn't, you weren't holy. But here's the interesting thing. Nowhere in the Bible does it talk about how high your hair can be, or whether you should hunt or not hunt. Now, today we may laugh at some of those things, but guaranteed over the years we've come up with our own ideas as to what constitutes holiness. So I grew up in a pastor's home, a holiness church. Some of you did too. And you may remember, some of you might remember this, and some of you are going to say, you guys were crazy, and we were. But we believed that playing sports on Sunday was a sin. You could not read the comics on Sunday. You could read them on Saturday and Monday, but not on Sundays. Now, you can't find anywhere in the Bible any of those prohibitions, but we believed them. And so what people did was they took something that they weren't comfortable with doing themselves, maybe because of their upbringing, maybe because of their history, maybe because of their personal conscience, and they said, well, if it's wrong for me, then I want to impose that on every other Christian, regardless as to whether that person feels it's wrong or not. And we continue to do that today. What happens is God speaks to us in a certain area in our lives, and he says, you need to make a change. And so we do. And instead of realizing that that change is not necessarily called sin in the Bible, and that it was actually only meant for us, God was speaking to us personally, we want to make that a new rule that everybody should follow. God told me to do it or not do it. That must mean now that he wants you not to do it or to do it. Now, I want to be really clear about something this morning. I'm not suggesting at all that we would accept things which are clearly stated as sin in the Bible. I'm talking about areas that are not addressed at all, gray areas, disputable areas. And Paul says it's in those areas that we need to show grace to other people by accepting that other people may see things differently and live differently than we do. Accept other people. Secondly, he says, stop judging when it's not our place to judge. In fact, 3 times in this chapter of Romans, Paul is going to tell us, quit judging each other. Verse 13 is just one example. Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. And what Paul is trying to get across to us is that there are some areas that are in dispute. And in those areas, it's not our right, it's not our place to force our thinking and our way of doing things on everybody else and then judge them if they do not comply. Now, I understand how difficult this can be because if I strongly feel that something is wrong for me, it can be so difficult for me to accept that it might be okay for somebody else to do it. Let me just give you an example. A few years ago, my wife and I were given some tickets to a movie, and so we decided to go. It was one of those Marvel movies. It was called Doctor Strange. And we went to the movie, and partway through, I just felt really uncomfortable about this movie. I didn't like some of the Eastern theology was coming through, and eventually I just felt God saying to me, Murray, you should get out of this movie. And I tried to, kind of talk about it with God, maybe negotiate. And I said, well, there's so many people in my row. We're right in the middle. It's going to disturb people. I shouldn't do that. And I just felt, no, you got to leave. And so then I said, what if I just close my eyes during the bad part? Maybe that would be okay. And then God just, so strongly, he said, get out now. And so I turned to my wife and said, I got to go. And she said, are you sick? And I said, no, I just got to go. So I went out and Pastor, what happened? I said, well, I explained to her. And she said, okay. And I said, if you want to go back and watch it, that's fine. I just don't think I can. So anyway, we left. Never saw how the movie ended, still don't know. Well, a couple of months later, I was sitting on an airplane. We're flying to Toronto for some meetings, and there's a fellow pastor beside me. And guess what he's watching? That very movie. And part of me is saying, how can you watch that? God told me so distinctly I shouldn't do it. Maybe I should just interrupt you and warn you that God doesn't want you to watch that. I'll admit there was part of me that wanted to start judging his particular walk with God. But that's not my place. He answers to God. He doesn't answer to me. The only person I really have to worry about is me. And believe me, that's a full plate to worry about. So if something is wrong for me, if God says don't do that, then I better not do it. But I can't necessarily expect that everybody else is going to feel that God's speaking to them about the same thing. You see, the problem with judging, and Paul's going to talk about this, he says it often leads to other things, two other things. In verse 3, he says it could lead to contempt. And Paul says the man who eats everything must not look down on him who does. And so if it's holy for me and you're not being holy like I am, I might say, oh, I'm a better Christian. You're kind of a sad example of what it means to follow Jesus. We can look at people with contempt. And Paul says, don't think of yourselves better than others because you do or don't do something. That leads to pride. And then the second thing is condemnation. In verse 3, Paul says, and the man who does not eat everything must not condemn the man who does. You see, when I end up judging someone, the next step is to condemn them, even if it's only in my mind. And so on the plane, I could say, I condemn this guy. He's just not as good as me. Look what he's watching. I remember some years ago reading a story of 53 residents in a neighborhood who had signed a petition to stop reckless speeding on their streets. And so the police set up a radar trap. And the first 5 violators they caught had all signed the petition. It's just that's who we are. We judge people and then we end up doing something similar or something even worse. So we need to be very hesitant, Paul says, about playing the role of judge when it comes to these gray areas. Judgmental people are not grace dispensers. Thirdly, Paul says, you can trust God to change people. You don't have to be the medium by which it happens. And so twice in this chapter, in verse 4, he says, who are you to judge someone else's servant? And in chapter and he says, to his own master he stands or falls. In verse 12, he says, so then each of us will give an account of himself to God. I think there's probably a number of reasons that we feel compelled sometimes to judge others. We hate what we think is sin. We think we're right and the other person is wrong. We want other people to be just as right as us. Maybe we feel bad about our own weaknesses, and to make ourselves look better, we want to point out the faults of others. Or maybe we don't like the fact that other people have freedoms that God has not given to us. Whatever the reason, Paul reminds us that our brothers and sisters are not necessarily answerable to us when it comes to gray matters. Unless God has given you a leadership position, it's not our place to go around cleaning up everybody else's life. Paul says each of us are God's servants. He has the power to change us if he wishes to. Now, that doesn't mean there's never a time to correct or admonish. And certainly none of us should be so unteachable that we wouldn't consider the advice or the wisdom of others as they present it to us. But we need to be careful that we're not trying to play God. We don't see all the facts. Maybe God is working in their lives in a different area, and we're not even aware of that. Or maybe we're just wrong in how we view certain things. And so instead, we can have this confidence, Paul says, that God, at the right time and in his own way, he will work with that person and deal with them if he feels he needs to. That person doesn't answer to us. We're not their Lord. The Bible very plainly tells us in these verses that we're not their master and that people don't act to please us. And of course, we all know this. When we get to heaven, it's not going to be you and me judging anybody. That's God's place alone. And so we need to extend grace to others. We need to give them time to grow and to allow them to grow maybe in different areas than God wants us to grow in. I love the confidence of Paul in this chapter, that he's willing to show to those who might even think differently than him on these disputable matters. In verse 4, he says, and he, this person that thinks different, this person that we might like to set straight, he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. You know, there's been various times in my life, even as a pastor, and I wondered, should I say something to that person about what I think is maybe happening in their lives that may not be good for them? And oftentimes I've decided to wait and instead pray for them. And it's amazing how God works, and the change that I was hoping might happen happens as God is working in them, not because I told them. Years ago, we had a young couple, a young family right across the street from our church come to salvation, and they started coming to our church, and this guy had been involved in a whole bunch of things, and one of the things he had was this incredible library of super heavy metal music. And I just, that's not, I mean, the best stuff for Christians to live, kind of listen. I thought, you know what, I don't need to say anything. And one day he came to me and he said, Pastor Murray, I just felt that maybe I should get rid of all that kind of music. So I just gave it all away. And I was a bit concerned because I thought maybe in the church somebody had kind of harangued him. I said, who told you that? He said, God told me. And I said, good, that's a good place to be. If you hear God and he tells you to do it, then you do it. That's more what we need to look for. Now, again, I'm not saying that there aren't times where advice or counsel would be a good idea, but if we constantly insert ourselves into a situation, we need to be very careful that our attitude and our motives and our lives are pure. We don't go around correcting others before we've cleaned up our own lives. Don't judge others. Trust God to change them. And lastly, give your efforts to promoting peace. Verse 19 says, let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. And so instead of trying to change other people so they line up with our personal convictions, we're to give our efforts to things which will lead to peace and harmony between us. There are far too many petty people in the church already. They don't need our help. I'm not talking about this church. I know this church. But there are there are people, People who seem to look for the faults in others. They hone in on they're the super sleuths of suspected sin. And they'll tell you they're doing it in love. And for the other person it's good, but too many times their words and their actions have the potential to lead to division. I want you to listen to this quote. It's a bit harsh. Take it as you kind of look at it. It's on the screen. Petty people are ugly people. They are people who have lost their vision. They are people who have turned their eyes away from what matters and focused instead on what doesn't matter. The result is the rest of us are immobilized by their obsession with the insignificant. It's time to rid the church of pettiness. It's time the church refused to be victimized by petty people. It's time the church stopped ignoring pettiness. It's time the church quit pretending that pettiness doesn't matter. Pettiness has become a serious disease in the Church of Jesus Christ, a disease which continues to result in terminal cases of discord, disruption, and destruction. Petty people are dangerous people because they appear to be only a nuisance instead of what they really are, a health hazard. So what's the correct action? Well, verse 22 says this in Romans 14. So whatever you believe about these things, eating meat offered to idols, worshiping on a certain day, whatever you believe, keep them between yourselves and God. Let me just give you an example. Maybe somebody has a conviction that playing sports on Sunday, it would not be God's best for them. It's okay for them to walk through a neighborhood but on a Sunday, but it's not okay to say golf. And so here's this person, they're walking, along the line. And if you're living in our neighborhood, we live on a golf course, and so wherever you walk, you kind of cross the course a couple of times, and you're walking, past the 16th hole, and you can't believe it because there's George. He's from church, and he's actually golfing on the Lord's day. And you're so tempted to go up to him and tell him how wrong, hey, how can you do this? Because it's wrong for you. You think it's wrong for everybody. But then you think to yourself, is there really any difference between me walking without a stick and George walking with a stick? And is it going to promote greater fellowship between us if I judge him? And so instead of judging him, I wave to him and I say, George, how's the game going? And when George says, terrible, you resist the urge to whisper to yourself, serves him right for golfing on Sunday. You see, Christians too often are guilty of trying to make everybody fit into their mold of what it means to follow Jesus. And we want everybody to see life through our glasses. And so when the Bible talks about unity, we think it means uniformity. We all act, we all look, we all do exactly the same, which of course is my way. Instead, the church needs to learn to operate in loving grace to each other, both within the church, but as well, we extend that grace to others in the body of Christ around the world. See, Romans chapter 14, according to what it says, the maturity is not just how I live, it's also reflected in my willingness to allow others to live their lives in Christ. Maybe even some ways that might even be somewhat foreign to me. In most religions of the world, it's fairly easy to see who's devoted and who's not. It's easy because most religions have a list of rules, of do's and don'ts, and if you follow them, you're good, and if you don't, you're not. Christianity is somewhat more difficult than that. In fact, when one super spiritual person asked Jesus, well, what is following you mean? What does God want from us? Jesus narrowed it down to two things: love God and love people. But the real problem is that seeing those two things, we're not always quite sure how to apply that. Now, yes, we have the Bible, and it gives us directions as to what love for God means and what it means to love others, but the tendency we have is to take those things further than intended, or to read into them some things that were never meant, or to make things up where the Bible is silent. So in closing today, I want to read you an excerpt from a book by Max Lucado. Many of you will know him. He says, God has enlisted us in his navy and placed us on his ship. The boat has one purpose, which is to carry us safely to the other shore. This is not a cruise ship, it's a battleship. We're not called to a life of leisure, we're called to a life of service. Each of us has a different task, some concerned with those who are drowning or snatching people from the water. Others are occupied with the enemy, so they man the cannons of prayer and worship, and still others devote themselves to the crew, feeding and training the crew members. Though different, we are the same. Each can tell of a personal encounter with the captain, for each has received a personal call. He found us among the shanties of the seaport and invited us to follow him, and our faith was born at the sight of his fondness, and so we went. We each followed him across the gangplank of his grace onto the same boat. There's one captain, one destination. And though the battle is fierce, the boat is safe, for our captain is God. The ship will not sink, for that there is no concern. There is concern, however, regarding this harmony of the crew. When we first boarded, we assumed that the crew was made up of others like us. But as we've wandered the decks, we've encountered curious converts with curious appearances. Some wear uniforms we've never seen, sporting styles we've never witnessed. Why do you look the way you do, we ask them. Funny, they reply, we're about to ask the same of you. The variety of dress is not nearly as disturbing as the plethora of opinions. There is a group, for example, who clusters every morning for serious study. They promote rigid discipline and somber expressions. Serving the captain's a serious business, they explain. It's no coincidence that they tend to congregate around the stern. There's another regiment deeply devoted to prayer. Not only do they believe in prayer, they believe in prayer by kneeling. For that reason, you always know where to locate them. They are at the bow of the ship. And then there are a few who staunchly believe real wine should be used in the Lord's Supper. You'll find them on the port side. Still another group has positioned themselves near the engine. They spend hours examining the nuts and bolts of the boat. They've been known to go below deck and not come up for days. They are occasionally criticized by those who linger on the top deck, feeling the wind in their hair and the sun in their face. It's not what you learn, those topside argue. It's what you feel that matters. You know how we tend to cluster. Some think that once you're on the boat, you can't get off. And others say you'd be foolish to go overboard, but the choice is yours. Some believe you volunteer for service. Others believe that you were destined for the service before the ship was even built. Some predict a storm of great tribulation will strike before we dock. Others say it won't hit until we're safely ashore. There's those who speak to the captain in a personal language, and there are those who think such languages are extinct. There are those who think the officers should wear robes. There are those who think there should be no officers at all. And there are those who think we're all officers and we should all wear robes. And oh, how we tend to cluster. And then there's the issue of the weekly meeting at which the captain is thanked and his words are read. All agree on its importance, but few agree on its nature. Some want it loud, others quiet. Some want ritual, others spontaneity. Some want to celebrate so that they can meditate. Others meditate so they can celebrate. Some want a meeting for those who've gone overboard, and others want to reach those overboard, but without going overboard and neglecting those on board. And oh, how we tend to cluster. The consequence is a rocky boat. There's trouble on the deck. Fights have broken out. Sailors have refused to speak to each other. There have even been times when one group refused to acknowledge the presence of others on the ship. Most tragically, some adrift at sea have chosen not to board the boat because of the quarreling of the soldiers. What do we do, we'd like to ask the captain. How can there be harmony on the ship? We don't have to go far to find the answer. On the last night of his life, Jesus prayed a prayer that stands as a citadel for all Christians. I pray for these followers, but I'm also praying for all those who will believe in me because of their teaching. Father, I pray that they may be one, as you are in me and I am in you. I pray that they also can be one in us. Then the world will believe that you sent me. How precious are these words. Jesus, knowing that the end is near, prays one final time for his believers. Striking, isn't it, that he didn't pray for their success, their safety, or their happiness. He prayed for their unity. He prayed that they would love each other. As he prayed for them, he also prayed for those who will believe because of their teaching. That means us. In his last prayer, Jesus prayed that you and I would be one. Would you stand with me? So we're not going to have a closing song today. We're not going to have a closing prayer. I just want you to go and be grace dispensers. Go into the foyer of the church, go into the hallways at work, go into the classrooms, the offices tomorrow. Go into your neighborhood. Take the bottle of grace, put your finger on the trigger, and start spraying. I mean, just let her rip. Soak your world with grace. God bless you. Hope you have a fantastic week.